Hey everyone, I'm really excited to be talking to you today. My name is Alyssa Sargen. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Washington. So I'm actually filming this talk in advance because while this session is happening live, I'm going to be in Ecuador doing some field work on this research topic. So today I'm going to talk about the intersection between movement and foraging ecology that we see with hummingbirds and how I plan to research that. And it turns out that there's a lot we still don't know about these topics. So let's get into it. So of course, an animal's given foraging strategy is its behavioral adaptations that let it successfully acquire food. And so hummingbirds are interesting to study for tons of different reasons, but one of them is that they feed from and pollinate flowers, which have a couple of key features in this case that I want to point out. So one, they're stationary, unlike the resources of lots of other animals. And two, they're also scattered across the landscape at very different scales depending on the reproductive strategy of the plant itself. So following from that, hummingbirds don't all forage on flowers the same way. They use multiple strategies. And because they hover and they rely on some really intense aerial maneuvers, which they're pretty well known for, hummingbirds are one of the most energetically constrained taxa. And so to put that into perspective, if we were going to expend as much energy as they did when they hover, we would need to drink 1 can of Coke per minute. So every calorie from that nectar really counts, and foraging strategies become especially important. Foraging strategies of hummingbirds are usually thought to fall into two major categories: territoriality and traplining. So on the left here, I've illustrated the sparkling violet ear. So that's thought to be a pretty classic territorial bird. And then on the right here, I have the white-tipped sicklebill, which is generally considered to be a trapliner. Now in a territory, we often see a patch or clumps of flowers together. And you can see that there are different flower types which tend to have shorter and straighter corollas and also less concentrated nectar or maybe lower volumes of nectar sometimes. And a territorial holder will forage on these flowers and also actively defend them from other birds at the same time. So if you've ever seen a hummingbird at a feeder, you're probably pretty familiar with this strategy, right? They're very aggressive, they chase other birds off. Now with a trapliner, they'll visit flowers in a repeatable sequence. So they cover really long distances while they forage, and then they restart the circuit, like we'll see in the animation in just a sec. So we can see that these flowers are more widely spaced. They're not occurring in big patches, right? They're also more specialized. So they tend to have longer and curvier corollas, and they also tend to have more concentrated nectar. So with all of that said, there isn't a whole lot of direct evidence to show that hummingbirds actually use long distance traplines. So with my research, I'm working to explore the movement patterns of hummingbirds that we consider to be trapliners. And one of the reasons that we lack information on this topic is that hummingbird movement is actually incredibly difficult to track. So with some kinds of birds, like songbirds, for instance, with really rigorous observations, you can track their movement manually in the field. But when it comes to studying hummingbirds in the wild and tracking their movement, it's more like trying to find a needle in a haystack. So to illustrate, I want to show you this video. Now this is your needle. As you can see, hummingbirds are incredibly small. So this particular species, the striped-throated hermit, weighs about as much as a United States penny. And hummingbirds, of course, they're not just small, right? They're also really fast. Some hummingbirds in forward flight have been clocked at over 30 miles per hour, which at his best, Usain Bolt reaches about 27 miles per hour. So that was your needle. Now this is your haystack. So this is my field site in Ecuador, which is where I'm going to be when you watch this video. So imagine taking that tiny hummingbird, which can fly much faster than you or I could ever run, and dropping it into this Ecuadorian cloud forest. And now imagine trying to track it. Suddenly, it becomes a lot more complex. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes explaining how I plan to tackle this issue. So with manual tracking being so challenging for this particular system, it's important to start considering advanced tracking technologies. The smaller an animal is, the fewer options you have in terms of what sort of electronics you can actually deploy on it. Generally speaking, an auxiliary marker shouldn't weigh more than roughly 5% of the animal's body weight, or else it could start to affect their movement, or in the case of birds, it could start to affect their flight. So when you're talking about a bird that weighs as much as a penny, which is 2.5 grams, your tag should weigh less than 125 milligrams, which is about as much as 5 grains of rice. So luckily, there's a lot of new technology being developed and miniaturized today. So there are new types of tags that will make tracking small birds much more feasible than it ever was before, even 5 years ago. I'll be using one of these new kinds of tags. So these are tiny radio tags that weigh as much as mini M&Ms. And as you can see, they're very small compared to my hand in the photograph here. So they're small enough to use on some larger species of hummingbirds, which makes them a great choice. And as you can see, the plan is to equip hummingbirds with these backpack harnesses with the tags threaded through. So a colleague of ours, Jessie Williamson, she's used a similar backpack on giant hummingbirds using GPS tags, and she's had a lot of success with that. So we're going to base our model for the harness off of hers. And I really encourage you to check out her work. It's awesome. So the tags I'll be using are paired with a grid of long distance receivers, which can collect tag data from up to 300 meters away and trilaterate their position. So with this grid, we can track hummingbirds' locations across space and time. And this is an example map of what those movement data would look like. So this will basically let us lift the veil on the movement of hummingbirds in the tropics and their different foraging patterns. So we should be able to get a much better understanding of traplining and confirm the extent and repeatability of their different circuits, or just see what the patterns look like in the first place. So to do that, I'm working with the white-tipped sicklebill, which, as you can see, is highly co-evolved with particular flowers. So because they're limited in where they can forage due to their shape of their bill, this will help me pinpoint exactly where they might go before I set up my receiver grid. And so they're also quite big for hummingbirds. They can weigh as much as 14 grams, which is about as much as 1.5 Oreos, which is big for a hummingbird. So sicklebills are, really interesting trapliners, but also they're very mysterious birds. We know very little about their natural history, and that includes where and how far they fly every day, or how rigidly they stick to visiting particular flowers. So by focusing on this system, I aim to give us a better understanding of those questions and of the movement and foraging behavior of hummingbirds in general. So that's a look into what I'm currently working on and what's to come. I'd like to thank the Behavioral Ecophysics Lab in the University of Washington. The O'Brien's Award for Tropical Studies and the Margot and Tom Wyckoff Award are both funding some of my work. I'd like to thank them. Nicole, my collaborator in Ecuador, and of course, hummingbirds, without which I would not have a project.